Bună seara și bine v-am găsit la Legile Afacerilor, cea de-a treia ediție. Așa cum vă spuneam încă de la primele două ediții, după două emisiuni de introducere, unde am avut invitați pe domnul Gheorghe Fodea, președintele Uniunii Naționale a Baroului din România și Ion Dragnea, decanul Baroului București, începem cu ediția a treia să ne îndreptăm în adâncime către spețe reale cu care se confruntă marile firme de avocatură din România. Pentru că invitații mei amândoi vorbesc limba engleză, o să discut cu ei în limba engleză, mulțumindu-le pe această cale colegilor de la Hot News care vor asigura traducerea pentru spectatorii noștri. Eu sunt Andrei Cristea, începe ediția a treia de Legile Afacerilor. Alongside of me, and I'm very glad to be here, let me introduce you Mr. Bryan Jardine, Theiss Romania, and Mr. Daniel Visoiu, partner BAC Romania Balkan Advisory Company. I'm very glad to be here at Legile Afacerilor, third edition at Hot News and Legal Marketing. Mr. Bryan Jardine, from many years in Romania, you lead Theiss, one of the best multinational lawyer company in Romania.
Yeah, that's right, Andrei. I've actually been in Romania. This will mark 20 years that I've been living and working in Romania on and off. I've also spent some time in Hungary, but in the region, let's say. 11 years ago, we set up Theiss here in Bucharest. Historically, the firm, it's an Austrian-based firm, so you can imagine we have a number of Austrian-based clients, and they've been some of the early movers in this market, particularly in the financial services sector. And we were fortunate enough to be involved in some of the significant deals, which really catapulted the firm into the market. And then more recently, we're just sort of focused on more diverse types of M&A. We've done some deals in the pharmaceutical, the energy sector, renewable energy, conventional energy, really across the board. Continue to do quite a bit in financial services sector as well. But I have to say that we've obviously seen the ups and downs over the last decade, certainly since the crisis in Romania. But we seem to, certainly last year, see quite a bit of activity in the M&A sector. So it's rather encouraging, and we just hope that the positive trends that we're seeing in the macroeconomic statistics will be borne out at the more micro level.
Romania has the highest growth of all 11 countries in Central Eastern Europe region, I think.
That's correct. I was reading a statistic not too long ago that I think we were the third behind two other countries. I can't recall, but that last year, was for our region, it was quite impressive, the statistics that Romania was able to post. So again, we're not certainly at the levels of growth that we were realizing back in 2007, 2008 before the crisis. But on the other hand, I think the growth that we are experiencing is a more sustained. It's not sort of a speculative bubble. A lot of that earlier growth was driven by an overheated real estate market in some instances. So I'm seeing the types of investors now are more serious institutional strategic investors, which I think bode well for the longer term development of Romania.
Theiss Romania, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is the second largest head office of Theiss after the headquarters in Vienna.
That would have been true 3 years ago, but in 2013 we acquired an office in Warsaw, in Poland, and that was an existing office of a German law firm. So we acquired the entire office of some almost 40 lawyers, which really catapulted that office into the second largest outside. But we are now, I think, third then behind in terms of the size and number of attorneys. So I think the firm is definitely committed to the Romanian market. We see this as a growth market, along with Poland. Obviously, that's why it was so important strategically for us to acquire a presence in Poland. And several of our offices are in smaller jurisdictions like Albania and Bosnia.
Of course.
And obviously there's not the economic profile there to drive a large office, but we're very bullish on Romania. We see it as an opportunity market. It's a market that I would have to add is populated by some very strong competition, very good law firms, both international and domestic. So it's always a challenge to work in a market where you have strong competition. But on the other hand, I think that's also good for Romania because it raises the bar for everybody. So you're getting more serious investors. You're getting investors that are well advised on both sides of the deal. For example, on an M&A, you'll see good lawyers on the sell side and the buy side. And I think we are always encouraged with the level of the competition. We see very, very good, strong law firms advising clients. And again, I think that's for the benefit of everybody. It's a win-win. So we
Win-win
welcome
situation.
that.
Yeah. Mr. Dan Visoiu, also strong experience in the region, Central Eastern Europe.
Indeed, Andrei, while I am, let's say, a lawyer, an attorney by profession, with BAC, I'm actually acting more or less as an investment advisor, as an investment banker. So, in essence, what we do is we try to originate the deals, which hopefully happen, and once in a while they do happen here. Indeed, as Bryan mentioned, we're also quite bullish on Romania. Having said this, it still is a market which is evolving. Many, let's say, sectors are, let's say, in terms of the potential, it's quite big, quite interesting. Having said this, Romania still has certain particularities, if you will, in terms of, let's say, smaller deal sizes as compared to Poland, for example, the number of deals. Nonetheless, indeed, Romania is definitely one of the most important players in the southeastern European, let's say, corner of Europe.
It's kind of different because the stock exchange market in Warsaw, Poland, I think it's the largest from the region, and it's not comparable with the Bucharest.
Absolutely.
Indeed. For example, to give you a concrete example, as far as we know, and we do have, for example, our BAC is actually one of the, let's say, registered brokers here in Bucharest, the BVB, as well as the Warsaw Stock Exchange, one of the preferred, let's say, brokers. And Poland has done things a bit different in the sense that, for example, they've listed all of their formerly state-owned companies, at least the major ones. They also required initially that their pension funds would have to invest up to 80% of their assets on the Warsaw Stock Exchange. So, simply put, just these two measures alone.
Yes. It's significant. Yes, it's a significant
tremendous, let's say, amount of volume, and really resulted in the Warsaw Stock Exchange, with let's say, the capital market in Poland being perhaps, I believe, that one of the top 10 in all of Europe. Having said this, Romania, for example, doesn't have to reinvent the wheel.
Of course.
Simply, it should look at what other countries have done and more or less, let's say, fine-tune, because obviously there were also a number of mistakes made in Poland as well, but these mistakes were more or less, let's say, minor in nature. But the bottom line is, getting back to Romania's potential, really just a matter of, let's say, fine-tuning what other countries have done. And my feeling is that, let's say, based on our professional experience, instead of having just 3.7% yearly economic growth, Romania could easily have over 6 or even 7%.
I think the hottest news in this market is today the merger of London Stock Exchange with the Deutsche Börse. I think they create the biggest and largest stock exchange in Europe every time.
It's obviously a very interesting, let's say, an important development for the European, let's say, capital market as a whole. Closer to home, we really should see, once again, much more, let's say, proactivity on, at least from the point of view of Romanian decision makers, to ensure that, let's say, within perhaps at most 5 years, Romania also gets much closer to being part of this, let's say, overall European capital market. Because at the end of the day, really, capital, let's say, a fully functioning and active capital market really is one of the fundamental elements of any free market economy.
And it unlocks access to, real capital and liquidity, which is sometimes missing. I mean, for most companies here, and I'm talking about local companies that are looking to go to the next level, your options are limited. You can either do an internal capital increase, which requires the shareholders to put money in essence, or you can try and get bank financing. But the banks, obviously, in many instances, are imposing some very difficult conditionality. So I know that what Dan and what BAC are doing is to try and position companies to perhaps avail themselves of opportunities on the stock exchange, and I think there's tremendous potential there. But the problem is we just haven't seen the historic levels of liquidity and activity that we should be seeing. And you mentioned Warsaw. I mean, I was reading an article that suggested recently that with the volumes and the size of the Warsaw Stock Exchange, that they might even be making a position or positioning themselves to go after the Vienna Stock Exchange, which would be kind of interesting. But whether you talk about mergers of stock exchanges, but I think it's unfortunate that Romania couldn't be more of an engine for growth in our region and have a vibrant capital markets which would attract investment capital and would enable again companies, especially SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to perhaps go to the next level to access some of this capital. And I know that Dan and his partners have worked on initiatives involving alternative exchanges as well, I think, which is a great idea. And maybe you could comment on that. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity here, and it's the same old story. You know, you need one or two success stories to really start to get traction. And until you get that, it's all sort of, to some extent, wishful thinking.
For example, when we try to sell, perhaps more accurate, I should say, when we pitch a potential U.S.-based investor, we don't pitch Romania as just the market of Romania. Romania now is part of the EU. So here you're talking about a workforce, for example, which is almost 100% fluent in English. You're talking about, obviously, costs which are much more reduced or lower than other EU jurisdictions.
We're talking about level of education in IT sector.
Or any sector.
Or any sector.
Not just the IT sector. So in essence, we actually, over the last, let's say, 6 months, we've seen a heightened level of interest from U.S.-based investors, also because of the political, let's say, instability in the other countries around this region. But nonetheless, increasingly, Romania is seen as a, let's call it a beachhead, an entry point into the EU.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the soft underbelly of Europe, so to speak, to borrow a phrase from Churchill, in the sense that you could establish a production facility in Romania or Bulgaria, perhaps. I think Romania has certain advantages. Maybe I'm biased, but over Bulgaria, and Dan mentioned the English fluency, the fact that we have a common alphabet as opposed to the Cyrillic. There's a number of other factors, but for many investors, they look at Romania as an opportunity to get into the EU. You can build out a production facility for relatively inexpensively. The workforce is generally lower, and then you can re-export or export the product into the EU. As you can use it as a launching pad effectively, without having to worry about the customs and import duties that you would otherwise face if you were manufacturing, for example, in North America and trying to import directly.
In Romania, also the level of taxation, I think now it's
relatively
appropriate.
Lower indeed. Well, Bryan can, perhaps get into greater details, but overall, Romania, not just from a regional point of view, but from an EU point of view, is perhaps, if not the, or one of the lowest, let's say, tax countries.
The value of the closed transaction, I think, reached $2.1 billion last year. It's significant. It's increasing.
Well, I think
surprisingly,
I think it could be better. I think if you compare it to some of our neighbors, even smaller jurisdictions like the Czech Republic, for example, where they're achieving levels that are higher, and historically, maybe not recently, but Hungary, and Dan knows very well. He spent a lot of time, as I did myself, in the early 2000s. And I think when Hungary was sort of the beacon of the region, and Romania could only aspire to that, but I think the roles have slightly reversed now, in part because of the political instability and the issues in Hungary. But I think that if you look at the size of the country, the potential of the country, the market, we should be achieving levels that are closer. Again, we should be emulating a country like Poland in terms of what we can achieve, and not benchmarking ourselves against Bulgaria, for example, with all due respect to our southern neighbors. But I think we should be in a different league, and I think we have the potential to be in a different league. And I think to get to your comment on the tax issue, I mean, this is one area where the EU does allow the countries to be somewhat competitive. So establishing tax policy is really what can differentiate you from other countries. So I invoke again Bulgaria. They have a 10% flat tax rate, which is very attractive. Romania at 16%, though, is still quite attractive. And then you have to look beyond the sort of headline profit tax. I think Romania is also, just as we know, dropped the VAT from 24 to 20%. It'll go to 19 next year. There's the corporate dividend tax has been reduced. Also, below the current 16 or former 16 to 5.5%. So these are incentives for investors. Now there are still the hidden taxes. Obviously there's the employment taxes, and the minimum salary has gone up. But I think in absolute terms, when you look at the minimum salary, for example, in Romania, it's still much better than, let's say, France or Germany, or even the Czech Republic, for example. So I think when you look at tax policy, that's one area where the member states have some degree of autonomy still within the EU construct, where you can differentiate yourself. And I think Romania's made some good moves in the past, in the sense that right after the crisis in 2009, they took the hard medicine, the austerity, at a time when a lot of people questioned, because they throttled growth. We went from a 7.9% growth in 2008 to a negative 7.9% contraction. But you're starting to see that those hard macro decisions that were made, actually, I think now we can start to scale back. We've dropped the VAT rates. Again, we've been able to drop the corporate dividend tax. So I think these are the stimuli that will help to drive and to differentiate Romania. But we have to ensure, the one thing that's critical is that we don't do the bait and switch, that you start to drop the tax and then the investors come piling in, and then you turn around and you change the laws. We saw that to some extent in the renewable energy space with the green certificates, and the way that was manipulated in unfortunate ways, and it's created a lot of issues and concerns, not just for players in that sector, but overall. When investors come to us and they hear these sort of anecdotal horror stories, for lack of a better term, we have to try and reassure them and say, well, yeah, there were instances where policies were perhaps not very rational, but we can differentiate and hope that looking forward that the government will be more visionary in understanding what they need to do to attract serious investment into this country, because it has tremendous opportunities. It's just there needs to be consistency and continuity in the legislative framework.
It's very important also to collect the VAT tax, not just
absolutely
not just
to collect it, and to also reimburse where when these companies go through a VAT audit. I mean, I'd heard stories that when Angela Merkel was here, that was one of the issues on the agenda. I mean, when your chancellor is speaking with your president about VAT refunds, it's gone beyond just being a nuisance to being a serious concern, and it shouldn't ever rise to that level. So I think there needs to be more. I mean, the legislative framework in many instances in Romania is very good, because it's been largely transposed from EU directives. But then you see that the devils in the details are in the implementation. And another sector we've seen some concerns more recently is with this recycling law. Where many of the companies that were authorized to manage the recyclable waste are now gone out of business, or they're not able to do the job, and many of the operators that sort of offloaded those responsibilities through contract are now facing potential liability, which again seems to be an odd situation when these companies were approved by the government as being certified, in essence, to deal with the recycling issue. So there's other examples where these things happen, and I always say it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think if you look at the general trends, I mean, Dan and I have been here a long time. You sometimes have to pinch yourself to remember what it was like 15, even 10 years ago, walking around Bucharest or in Romania. That the advancements and the improvements are really quite remarkable. And I think everything from the quality of life, the social infrastructure, the sort of soft indicators of what Romania has been able to achieve. So I think in many instances, Romanians, we talk about the cab drivers and others, tend to be their own worst critics. If you look from the outside in, you can see there's been some remarkable progress made, but yet there could be so much more that could be getting done. It sometimes frustrates, because you realize there's such tremendous opportunity and potential that could be unlocked if, again, systems were implemented that don't have to be invented from scratch. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's importing best practices from other jurisdictions and mirroring those. And I think you would have a country that could be really a lighthouse for the entire region.
You say the keyword infrastructure. In Romania, infrastructure remains a black hole, let's say. It's pity.
I would say it continues to be more or less just a topic of discussion, because although indeed a certain number of kilometers of freeway, let's say, have been built over the last few years, but this is really, I would say, not even the tip of the iceberg. I go back to what I mentioned earlier, what are the key elements of a free market economy. From the very beginning, after 1990, this should have been one of the top, let's say, 3 priorities, if not priority number 1. But what has happened, or what has not happened, is in the past. Fortunately, I would say current decision makers are a bit more evolved. They have, in terms of, let's say, knowledge about what is required for, let's say, the real, let's say, positive exploitation of Romania's economic potential. If I'm not mistaken, next week, the so-called master plan in terms of infrastructure should be finally approved by the European Commission, which is obviously a very important step. Having said this, and I go back to financing, really a lot of these infrastructure projects will depend on whether they are, so let's say, bankable, if they would be set up as structured as a PPP, public-private partnership project, or even if we're talking about accessing funds from the European Union, they have to be structured from a financial point of view.
And I think part of the problem has been, the English use an expression, queering the pitch, or we say poisoning the well. Many of the investors have been burned over the last 10, 15 years. 13 years ago, I guess now, 12 years ago, we were involved on one of the early attempts to build one of the highways in Romania. And, these deals fell apart after the 2004 election. The new government came in and basically reassessed and changed everything, and it's, as we say, Monday morning quarterbacking. The problem is that it creates a distaste for the investor community, because what happens is they've sunk a lot of what they call development costs in terms of feasibility studies, hiring advisors. They think the project will go ahead, and when it doesn't go ahead, Romania then gets on their blacklist, let's say, and they say, they could say, we got a wonderful opportunity. Their development guys will say, they're building a new highway in Romania. They say, Romania? We were there 10 years ago, and it cost us millions, and nothing happened. So what happens then is the best companies tend to stay away, and you'll get maybe second-rate or third-rate companies that'll tender on, or that will bid on these tenders. And, it's the old saying, you get what you pay for. So I think one of the challenges for any new government will be to sort of say, as Dan said, the past is the past. We have now a professional team. We're going to negotiate in a professional standard. We're going to have Western standard expectations in terms of the financing and the warranties and all of the ancillary developments that would be associated with the project. So if there is a feeling that there's sort of a new sheriff in town and that there will be a serious counterparty in the on the Romanian side, then perhaps we can reattract some of these serious players who really know how to build highways and build them right, or build bridges, or construct power plants, or whatever types of infrastructure may be needed. I would note that one of the good developments has been, again, at the EU level, which will be transposed, is the e-procurement, the new directives, which will enhance the transparency, and certainly in the process there will be a much more, again, transparent and thorough process, which will allow bidders to be engaged in the process, and you hopefully won't get these situations, or the circumstances won't exist for situations of cooked tenders, or companies that are ill-qualified being awarded on bids, and then it turns out they can't do the work, and you lose 6 months or a year. You have to re-tender, and we've seen that in many instances as well. So I think with the improvements in the procurement law, hopefully that will also give comfort to investors that they will get a fair treatment in the process.
Having said this, and getting back to specifically 2016, we, BAC, focus, I would say, 100% on private deals, nothing to do with any state authority. And many entrepreneurs, the one thing which they always seem to say is, I just want the state to stay out of my business, for lack of a better way to put it. In other words, as long as the state doesn't get involved and change things tremendously, as was the case, for example, with the green certificates about 3 years ago, more or less the private sector will evolve in a positive, let's say, positive manner. This year, 2016, perhaps because of the so-called technocrat government, because the political parties are getting ready for the elections in November, what we have noticed is that really no major political issues to deal with. And at least our current clients and the ones we're pitching as we speak are quite happy about the situation, because they're quite optimistic about the fact that their businesses will continue to grow as they have in 2016, perhaps let's say a bit more. Or quite more, because a good number are in the ITC sector and let's say the agricultural sector and so on and so forth. So really 2016 is, although indeed an election year, at least indications so far, and this being the middle part of March, are that really things will not slow down. They will, in essence, continue to grow as they have in the past. Whatever. I mean, the growth trend will continue.
I'm reminded of the expression that I think it was Calvin Coolidge, who otherwise unforgettable U.S. president from the 1920s, and his famous saying was, "The business of America is business." And this is sort of the mantra of the, let's say, in the U.S. it would be the Republicans, but the idea that let business run itself, and to some extent the market will dictate. I think you have to find a happy median. Obviously, that led to the Great Depression, so you have to have some degree of regulation. But I think Dan's right. If you establish sort of the general ground rules, and if companies are operating within those ground rules and abiding by the law, then they should be free to sort of do their business. Because again, if you impose some kind of an oppressive tax, in the short term, it may look like it increases your revenues, your tax base. What it does, though, it kills the desire of these companies to invest. And moreover, they start hiring people, and actually these people then will pay income tax. These people will buy houses and pay property tax. So it really drives the whole economy. So I think in some of the here, what the country really needs is maybe less regulation and more trust that if you let business folks do the business, they'll do it correctly, again, especially in the private sector, because I think people generally, at the end of the day, they want to abide. If the laws are rational and reasonable, they will abide, because the costs of evasion are higher than compliance. So this is what I think. But it's when you start changing the laws and creating onerous regulations that companies and people become incentivized to try and evade. And I think this is what we need to avoid. And again, the medium to longer term benefits will inure to Romania overall, because you'll see a growing economy, more tax revenues coming in from various sectors, and this will allow the government to then reinvest these monies into highways and improve schools and hospitals. And these are the things that's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It gets things generating and really starts to see a vibrant and growing economy. And again, we've seen it happen. This happens in countries like India, where they slash a lot of the regulations, and suddenly you're unleashing the potential of some of these businesses.
I was just simply going to add, a concrete example is, once again, getting back to Poland. Poland, right after, let's say, so-called revolution or revolutions in the region, 1990, they were not, economically speaking, they were not better off than Romania.
Another kind of revolution in Romania, so a soft revolution was in Poland.
More or less. The idea is, because of their shock therapy, today the economic results at that, for example, pensions are much higher than they are here. Social assistance payments are much higher than they are here. Therefore, to me, it's a bit, let's say, incredible from a policy point of view when I see on TV here such types of discussions. Oh, let's increase pensions, let's increase the level of social assistance, because really what a responsible decision maker should be doing is they should actually be focusing on reducing the costs, ensuring that the economy, or I should say economic growth, will be much higher, so that, for example, in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, realistically,
medium
perhaps
term,
a bit longer, that's when the pensions will be higher, because again, much more tax income coming into the budget, and at that time, I would say social, let's say, payments or amounts would be much higher. So really, what I've seen so far, at least in the let's say the past few years, is too much short-term outlook on behalf of decision makers, instead of actually looking at the medium and especially the longer term. Because at the end of the day, hopefully we will not be having these same discussions in 10 years' time.
Mr. Jardine, last words, it's yours. Optimistic or, let's say, realistic in terms of medium?
I'm optimistic, honestly. I think, as I said earlier, there's, for a variety of reasons. One, we have a political commitment, if you will, on all sides to sort of taking Romania forward. Nobody's talking seriously about removing Romania from NATO or from the EU, which I think would be a disaster. I think Romania's strength, as I mentioned earlier, is really being part of the EU, and not for the obvious reasons people say, oh, the EU means we're going to get lots of money for big infrastructure projects. As a lawyer, I have to say what the EU brings really is stability in the legislation. There's we're seeing these directives being transposed, which really are looking longer term. It's what Dan said. You need to have a longer term, and the EU has a longer term, whether it's in environmental protection, whether it's in policies, the energy policy. We're talking about 2030 strategies, and how to position Europe for the next challenges in the generation ahead. And I think this requires the member nations to think longer term, whereas if they were just thinking in 4-year cycles, election cycles, maybe they wouldn't have these more strategic views. So to the extent that Romania is part of the family, if you will, of the EU, I see this as a very positive thing, which bodes well for Romania. I think the other thing I often mention, what I'm intrigued and see that's happening is the younger generation that came of age after the revolution. It's been 26 years now. You're talking about people that aren't just in the workforce, but are starting to achieve levels of power and position within, whether it's the government, whether it's in private sector. And these are people that have come of age under systems where there are principles of corporate governance that one takes on board, of ethics and doing business. It's not the old schmeckeria, as we say, way of doing business. And these younger folks are really the hope for Romania, because I think that they understand what it means to be a part of the European community of countries. And I'm also encouraged by seeing the number of young Romanians who have gone to the West, maybe to make money, and then want to come back to Romania because they realize at the end of the day they can have a good quality of life here. So there's and this is being to some extent enabled by social media and the ability to really get the word out. And I think that some of these younger folks are really, they're extremely bright. As Dan mentioned, they're very English savvy. Yeah. They can communicate with the external world. They have exposure to the world in a way that obviously the prior generation never had. So I think you're going to unlock the potential of the Romanian people. So I've been here, as I said, quite a number of years. I really love the country. I think it's to me it's a country that has the quality of life. It's a safe country, relatively low crime rates. The people are very passionate people, and I'm very optimistic. I think a lot of these issues that Dan and I have talked about today, I think are voicing to some extent when we voice the negative side of it. It's the frustration at seeing, with a few tweaks, as they say, or adjustments, and again, importing best standards, not necessarily reinventing the wheel. Romania has such tremendous potential, and everybody will benefit. And it seems like, again, it's the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and I'd like to see 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, because at the end of the day, everybody will benefit. So, yeah, in short, I'm very optimistic, and I'll continue to do what I can, my small part, to encourage investors to look seriously at Romania and to consider this as a place that they should be.
Thank you very much for being here, Bryan Jardine, Managing Partner, Theiss Romania, and also Daniel Visoiu, Partner, BAC Romania. I'm Andrei Cristea. Until next time on Legile Afacerilor, I wish you to have a great and warm evening. Thank you very much.